With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 350 plus undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another in a series of Infinite Inning reissues. I am Stephen Goldman, your host, as I was nearly 8 years ago when this episode was first issued. We go back this week to episode 79 from November 2018. It happens that in our most recent new episode, I talked about the Hall of Fame outfielder slash mutant, Hack Wilson, and so I thought I would bring back this one, in which I opened with a story of Hack going into the stands after a heckler, which is somewhat germane to the present day, as in one baseball story of recent weeks, which sent the chattering class chattering, was the so-called fan at the Diamondbacks at White Sox game who said something, made some remark about Ketel Marte's mom, who died tragically several years ago in a car accident. Marte was not ready for that sort of heckling and reacted extremely emotionally by weeping on the field. Had he climbed into the stands, I don't know that anyone would have blamed him either, but he most likely would have been suspended because baseball can't permit that for a number of reasons. This jerk in the stands, who was subsequently banned from every major league ballpark, may not have been aware that Marte's mom had even passed. He was perhaps simply trying to make a your mother joke. Your mother is so fat. Now, why any of that is necessary, benignly intended, or as benignly intended as heckling can be, I don't know. These guys on the field, they're entertainers. They're trying to make a living. Yes, it's a very good living when they are good at it, as Marte is, but in no way does that grant anyone a license to go after them on any personal basis whatsoever, and I'm afraid that when you're talking about someone's mom, they get to judge what they take personally, or in this case, moves them to recall the feeling of losing that person. As you'll hear, Hack went into the stands, he paid a price for it, but you know, even when it comes to something like Ty Cobb infamously going into the stands after one Claude Luker, who could not adequately defend himself due to the loss of a whole bunch of fingers, I feel like you forgo the deference that we might show you due to your injury if you're shouting racial epithets at someone. In our second story, we revisit the two men who essentially founded the Giants team, New York, San Francisco, wherever they go next. Hey, they're all moving. It's just that some of them are moving very slowly, or more slowly than others. They did that, and then they wound up with pretty much nothing. And that seems like an appropriate theme for this specific moment in American history. As we get into the flashback part of the show, you'll hear a brief reference to that episode's guest, Jesse Spector, and an exchange we had regarding Jackie Robinson. I decided to leave it in, even though the conversation with Jesse is not part of this reissue, as the guests have not been part of this reissue series. If I had a whole lot more time, or a really perspicacious assistant, I might say, hey, let's go back, listen through all those conversations, and pull out some highlights which still play all this time later, boil them down to a couple of very solid potpourri kinds of episodes, but right now that's just not feasible for me to do. Speaking of feasible, you know what's feasible? Vacations, breaks, a little time off, and thus here is a quick note. If you are listening to both this reissue series and our ongoing regular series, that this will be the sole Infinite Inning release for this week, the first week of July. I'm going to take Friday, July 4th off to spend time with my family. I very much appreciate your patience, your tolerance, your indulgence, whatever word you would like to use. I am grateful for it, as I am your coming round for all these episodes, old, new, borrowed, blue, what have you. Today happens to be a tough day, not in a baseball sense, but, well, if you're a Yankees fan, it's a pretty bad day. You went 13-14 in June, and then you opened July with yet another loss. Rather, today is a tough day because it's the day that a very deleterious, impoverishing bill passed the Senate and will soon go to the House, or will need to be reconciled with the House version of the bill. But there's little reason to think that it won't become law, and a lot of people might be immiserated, particularly if they lean on the government for health care. I saw one of the high-ranking Republicans, it may well have been Steve Scalise, who said something to the effect the other day that only 35 million Americans live below the poverty line, but yet 70 million Americans are on Medicaid. Therefore, that's fraud. And yow, that's painful because, first of all, 35 million Americans, more than 10%. What greatest country in the world has a tenth of its population living in poverty? Second, the definition of poverty is very conservative. So an American can be legally above the poverty line and still be in very dire straits, which is why you have a doubling of the number above the poverty line, which is to say 35 million people don't have the dough to pay for adequate medical care. Simultaneously, another 35, so now we're up to more than one-fifth of the American population today may also not have funds for adequate medical care, but they do have $1 more than would place them under the poverty line in terms of their income. That's not a problem with fraud, it's a problem with the definition. And some of those people, many of those people, are not lazy, they're not indolent, they're not sponging off the taxpayers, but may be productive members of society, people for the United States of America, as Casey Stengel put it. Patriotic and hardworking Americans who, nevertheless, can't make enough money to sustain themselves in a very expensive society. What are they supposed to do? Take up subsistence farming? It doesn't work like that anymore. As I was hit by this news, I turned to one of the greatest albums of the 1980s. It just made it in during early 1989. Lou Reed's New York is a kind of miracle in that Reed was an amazing songwriter, and when engaged, he could be a pretty great performer too, but whether it was drugs or his well-documented emotional problems, or just that he couldn't bring himself to care sometimes, if you caught him on the wrong night or on the wrong album, he tended to be restless and undisciplined. Restless can mean experimental, and sometimes experimental can be good, and sometimes experimenting can be directionless, again, if the mind doing the experimenting is not fully engaged. In the classic 4 Velvet Underground studio albums and the 2 albums of outtakes that comprise an aborted 5th, and those are wonderful, his tendency to throw away at bats was curtailed. And it's odd to me because by the time I was old enough to be aware of him, he came off as being sort of a stiff-necked perfectionist. But all you have to do is listen to his long post-Velvet's output to see that his work could be all over the place, from the sublime to the insulting to the audience. Most famously in his 1975 album Metal Machine Music, which may or may not have been made as a middle finger to RCA Records, but definitely functioned as a middle finger to those who bought it. Depending on your point of view, I must allow that for some people, it is creative noise, and for others, just noise, period. I find that it's sometimes interesting noise, but having said that, I also don't choose to listen to it. I very much doubt anyone does, but more than that, again, it isn't something you should offer to your fans. Not for money. When the Beach Boys did Pet Sounds, that was an experiment and a departure from their previous sound. When the Beatles did Rubber Soul, Revolver, those were a departure from their previous sound, and I'm sure that they lost some people. As I recall, Pet Sounds did not sell, and yet, whether you were a fan of those groups and appreciated the direction that they chose, you can't say that they skimped on songcraft. The opposite, if anything. Whereas Lou just threw it all away, and that wasn't the only time that you felt like he was phoning it in. Now, that said, putting Metal Machine music aside, even his worst albums have some value to them, because he was so good that he couldn't write, say, 10 songs without hitting on one or two good ideas, even if by accident. Robert Christgau called his 1986 album Mistrial expedient, while still giving it a grade of B, basically saying this is merely functional by this man's standards, however, still well above replacement level. Inspired Lou, great. Uninspired Lou, still occasionally rewarding, even if you could tell he wasn't completely engaged. If he wasn't, you weren't likely to be either, but since I was devoted and bought most of his albums out of the $4.99 cassette cutout bin, I wasn't too upset. Now, I don't listen to Mistrial very often, but when I do, I'm always amused by the song The Original Rapper. W-R-A-P-P-R, not R-A-P-P-R, but that's the gag. It's a bad pun. It's also Lou making fun of his own staccato delivery, and occasionally he throws in a baseball reference. Hey, pitcher, better check that batter. Make sure the candy's in the original wrapper. In the age of streaming and the ability to make playlists and slice and dice an artist catalog however you want to, for better and sometimes for worse, the original wrapper can be lifted out as if by a marine salvage. And hey, it's a good tip for Halloween. Make sure that candy's in the original wrapper. Speaking of Halloween, while some of the songs on Lou's New York album are super specific to that moment in time, like the murder of elderly black woman Eleanor Bumpers by the NYPD, some of them, like Halloween Parade, are a timeless memorial to the toll that AIDS took on an entire community up through that time. A toll that the government had pointedly not mentioned very much, if at all, because some elements within it, perhaps the majority, thought that the virus was God's judgment on homosexuals. I hasten to say that not only was that a horribly bigoted and unscientific belief, but as we learned in our own time with COVID, viruses do not discriminate. They just come for people. Isaac Asimov and Arthur Ashe weren't gay. They didn't pick up AIDS from unsafe sex or a dirty needle. They got it due to blood transfusions they received during routine medical procedures, as anyone might have done. About 2 months after Reed's New York album came out, the New York Times, remember the Times? Yeah, the old Times. Well, they published an article about Allison L. Gertz. Working backwards, Gertz has been gone now, due to AIDS, for about a third of a century, assuming she would have had no other misadventure, which of course you can't assume, but still, had the virus somehow missed her, she'd be 59 now, only 59. Instead, she was gone at 26 years old. How did that happen? If she was neither a gay man nor a lesbian who picked the wrong partner, nor an intravenous drug abuser? Well, now we know. Now we can accept it. But back then, people couldn't. When she was 16, this would have been in 1982, she had a single sexual encounter with a male who turned out later to be bisexual and unsafe in his own practices. He was 27, by the way. It was a different time in that sense, at least for some people, and he subsequently died of AIDS. Just the luck of the draw and some unsafe sex, but not in the way that they probably thought it was. She said it was one romantic night. There were roses and champagne and everything. That was it. I only slept with him once. She said one doctor insisted she had to have used IV drugs or had anal sex, but she hadn't. Unfortunately, a lot of people just flip by age reports about gay men and addicts, she said. They think it doesn't apply to them. They can't turn the page on me. I could be one of them or their daughter, and they have to deal with this. And of course, in countries other than ours, AIDS did break out of the high-risk subset of the population into the population more generally. Her parents' only child, Allie Gertz, died in August 1992. I am not religious, and yet it seems to me that the expression, there but for the grace of God go I, is something we should say to ourselves daily as a kind of mantra. Sub in the deity of your choice, or divine providence, or the great cosmic wheel of fortune. Sky Monkey. I prefer Sky Monkey of late. It doesn't really matter. It will still be true. On the same day that she disclosed her illness, which brought with it, at the time, huge amounts of stigma to promote just how easy it was to catch this disease, the sports section of the Times lamented that the Yankees had failed to acquire Lenny Dykstra from the Mets. Simultaneously, they were trying to interest the Mariners in sending Mark Langston to New York and giving Jay Buhner back. I'm not the general manager and I'm not the boss, said Yankees manager Dallas Green. But my suggestion would be to keep banging away at a trade. I'd like to get Dykstra. I like his pizzazz. If Dykstra were not to be acquired, the competition for the center field job would remain between Roberto Kelly and Bernie Williams, who both turned out to be pretty good players, and it just goes to show you the extent to which everyone associated with the Yankees during the high Steinbrenner years was prejudiced against their own prospects. Remembering this is trivial, of course, compared to remembering Miss Gertz. As I said a moment ago, a lot of Lou Reed's New York album is very much of its moment. It's ripped from the headlines, although oddly, a reference to Jimmy Swaggart is very timely, given that the disgraced evangelist and cousin to the late Jerry Lee Lewis died today as I record these words at 90 years old. Hell, Donald Trump is invoked, as well as Rudy Giuliani, and Iran too. The Ayatollah bought a nuclear warship. If he dies, he wants to go out in style, in a song aptly titled Sick of You. As the big, beautiful bill, as they call it, which will hurt so many, passed the Senate, I thought about the album's climactic song, Straw Man, which is so righteously angry. And it's not even about Darryl Strawberry, then having a somewhat disappointing final season with the New York Mets before departing as a free agent for the Dodgers, nor even Dykstra, who the Mets would send with Roger McDowell and a player to be named later for Juan freaking Samuel that June. I don't know who the Yankees did or didn't offer that March, but he couldn't have been as much of a miss as Juan Samuel. Kevin Maas, Bam Bam Mullins, Hal Morris, Scott Kamenicki, Dave Island, Steve Adkins. I paused to note that Steve Adkins was one of the funniest prospect boondoggles of that time. He was a wild lefty, selected in the 15th round. He was built up as a comer, a top 100 guy, and the roughly 5 or so guys per 9 that he walked were dismissed or excused as an artifact of minor league umpires who couldn't accurately call his knuckle curve. Well, the Yankees called him up in 1990. He walked 29 batters in 24 innings, and we learned that that was so much hype. Straw Man begins, "We who have so much, to you who have so little, to you who don't have anything at all. We who have so much more than any one man does need, and you who don't have anything at all." And that's almost a non sequitur in the song, because it's as if the over people are speaking. They never do give an accounting of themselves, those who have so much, to those who have so little. Rather, Reed seems to interrupt them to ask a series of pointed questions. Does anyone really need $1 billion rocket? Does anyone need a $60,000 car? Does anyone need another president? Or the sins of Swaggart, part 6, 7, 8, 9? The chorus of the song repeats, "Straw man going straight to the devil, straw man going straight to hell." A straw man is a false argument meant to distract from the actual issue at hand, or a false person meant to keep the birds from earning a living. Reed meant both. He was talking about those who had so much and then lie and obfuscate and reach into your pocket while they're patting you on the back and say that they're giving to you when they're really taking. Lou said something I needed to hear today. If you give it a listen, I hope it will help you process this endless voyage we are on, in which we are endlessly sailing away from warm Philadelphia in 1787. That's it for me in this reissue episode. I'll be back on the breaks, or perhaps to close things out at the end. Thank you so much for listening.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
In the infinite inning, sometimes you have to sit back and watch even the losers win big. On June 21st, 1928, the Chicago Cubs were playing a doubleheader against the visiting St. Louis Cardinals. The Cubs were not a bad team that year. They ultimately went 91-63, though they only finished third, but even then, they were only 4 games behind the team that ultimately finished first, which was those same Cardinals. They were managed by a future Hall of Famer, Joe McCarthy. They had the best catcher in the game at the time, Gabby Hartnett. They had Kai Kyler in the outfield, and Hack Wilson too. And the third outfielder, Riggs Stevenson, was a career .336 hitter. The pitching staff didn't get the same respect from Cooperstown, but it was good, with pitchers like Pat Malone, Charlie Root, Guy Bush, and Art Neff, who were all good enough to win 15 or 20 games on a couple of occasions each, but just didn't have the career length that Hall of Fame voters tend to look for. In short, this was not a team that anyone should have been angry at. They were not wasting their fans' time. They were not tanking. They were making a serious effort to win. They were not this year's Marlins or the Baltimore Orioles or the entire AL Central aside from Cleveland. They were real. There were things to come and look at, or I should say players to come and look at, and they played in a great ballpark besides. But as you well know, some people are determined to be unhappy no matter what you give them, and a few of them, maybe more than a few of them, turned up at that doubleheader with the Cardinals. The Cubs even won the first game 2-1. It was a rather uneventful game with just one extra base hit, a Chick Hayfie triple, but still they won. Game 2 was probably more of a drag for the hometown fans, for anybody really, because the Cubs got behind early, with the Cardinals scoring 4 runs in the top of the first on a Frankie Frisch RBI single and a 3-run triple by Sonny Jim Bottomley. The Cubs came back with a single run of their own in the bottom of the frame, and that was that. I don't know about you, but I really hate that kind of game. The score was 4-1 at the end of 1, and it was 4-1 at the end of 9, and you just could have skipped the rest of the thing. But of course, you don't know that till after it's over. In that second game, with the Cubs trailing 4-1 in the bottom of the 9th, Hack Wilson batted with 1 out. If you don't know Hack, I assume if you're listening to this show, you know Hack, but if you don't, no shame. He's in the Hall of Fame, though he's really there for only one season, 1930, when he won the NL Triple Crown and set the record for RBIs in a season by driving in 191. It was listed as 190 for forever, by the way, but somewhere someone going over the records picked up an extra RBI that had been missed all that time. He was one of the oddest physical specimens in baseball history. Even now, all these years later, you can still say that. At 5'6" and 190 pounds officially, he looked like Popeye. He looked like, and I've used this description many times, an inverted bowling pin. There's a picture of him with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and it looks like these two Yankees are posing with some kind of circus sideshow performer. That's the wonderful thing about baseball, though. He could play. The game lets a lot of different kinds of physical specimens play and play well. And in his case, imagine if Jose Altuve, who is listed at the same height, was thick instead of fast, with 50 home run power and probably stank of stale beer. That was Hack Wilson. I guess there are a few other things I should mention besides the fact that he looked like a giant baby holding a baseball bat. He was a Giants prospect and got Rule 5'd to the Cubs in what was supposedly a paperwork screw-up. There are a lot of stories about him making misplays in the outfield despite his being a center fielder. And if not for the RBI record, he'd probably be most famous for a misplay that he made in the 4th game of the 1929 World Series against the Philadelphia A's. This was in the famous 10-run 7th inning. The Cubs were up 8-0, and it looked like they had the game locked down, and then just everything stopped working. And in the midst of that, Mule Haas hit a high fly to center field, and Wilson, who was wearing sunglasses, still managed to miss it. It bounced around in center field long enough for the bases to clear and for Haas to get an inside-the-park home run. And although even then you can't blame Hack for the whole 10-run inning, or the fact that Cubs pitchers couldn't hold an 8-run lead, well, people kind of felt that way. Hack Wilson had a very severe drinking problem. He drank to the point of self-destruction, to the point that it curtailed his career and indeed his life. That may or may not have something to do with the sheer number of fights that he got in. I don't think he was somebody like Ty Cobb who walked around with a chip on his shoulder and was belligerent on occasion just for the sake of being belligerent. I suppose that playing Major League Baseball while broadly resembling Danny DeVito is probably not an easy thing. You have to have a high tolerance for insults, and for whatever reason he didn't. this was one of the days that he didn't. Heading into that ninth inning at bat that day, he had gone 1 for 1 with 2 walks. Not a bad day. Instead of sparking a rally, though, he grounded out to second base. As he was dragging himself back to the dugout, a fan, one Edward Young, who later identified himself as a milk wagon driver, shouted, "Why in hell don't you bench yourself, you fat so-and-so?" That so-and-so, I feel a little embarrassed repeating it to you here, because it's no doubt a paraphrase for something that was much more colorful and devastating, but couldn't be printed in a newspaper of the time. Today, in part because of some of the issues that have attended the current president, all boundaries are gone now as far as what words are fit to print, because if a presidential candidate is caught on tape saying he likes to shake hands with women by not shaking their hands, but a certain portion of their anatomy, and he refers to that portion of anatomy by a certain word, well, I suppose you can paraphrase it, but it loses kind of the revealing earthiness of the language. That's why Richard Nixon was so embarrassed to have been picked up using so many 4-letter words on the Watergate tapes, and insisted that the transcripts of those tapes did not include said cuss words, but instead replaced them with the phrase expletive deleted, which just made everything worse by calling attention to how often it appeared. Whatever Milkman Young actually did say, it was serious enough to really get under Hack's skin. It might not have been the first thing that Milkman Young said. The Chicago Tribune reported it this way: "The noisy fellow had been operating all afternoon in tones that were audible all over the park, and Hack had him spotted. Finally, the self-appointed public nuisance employed language that he didn't find in a book, and as Hack's patience was at an end, he went over to the rail and, well, Hack just choked the hell out of him." Hack, who, as I said, was inebriated a good 99% of the time, climbed into the stands and proceeded to pound the milkman until some of his teammates pulled him off, although the milkman alleged that they didn't just pull him off, but took some shots of their own. That includes Gabby Hartnett and a reserve corner guy named Joe Kelly. By the time they were done with him, the milkman's face was bruised to hell and all swollen up. In a kind of equal and opposite reaction that will be familiar to you from our social media, where one person taking the liberty of acting out in some transgressive way will empower thousands of others to do likewise, about 5,000 fans were so stimulated by this melee in the stands that they rushed onto the field. If you think about it, the team and the spectators temporarily switched places, and this was counterproductive for everybody because the game wasn't even over. Hack had only been the second out. They had to wait about 15 minutes until the field could be cleared to actually resume the game, at which point Riggs Stevenson popped out to first base, and it was finally over. My third favorite part of this story was that Milkman Young was arrested, thrown in jail, and prosecuted for inciting a riot. He was eventually fined $1 plus court costs. Hack was fined $100 by the National League. My second favorite part is that, although Hack didn't drive in or score a run in the doubleheader, he reached base in 4 of 7 trips to the plate, which is pretty good, and heading into the day, he was hitting .301 with, and nobody knew this, of course, a .402 on-base percentage and a .582 slugging percentage. He was having a very good year, regardless of what Milkman Young said, but some people, and I guess some milkmen, are just never satisfied. My favorite part, though, and I use favorite in a way that you should understand is meant to be taken with no little dollop of sarcasm, was that after all this happened, the milkman sued Hack Wilson for $50,000. The case dragged on for a year, with Hack at one point testifying that he just meant to go talk to the guy, but whoops, he somehow slipped into the stands on top of him, and then whoops, his fist slipped into his face repeatedly. All of us have had this happen to us at one time or another, have we not, Your Honor? I imagine that line of defense didn't seem too promising because Hack and the milkman ended up settling for $20,000. Most likely the Cubs picked up the tab because Hack was no better at retaining his money than he was at retaining his temper. Sometimes I see an antisocial guy or guys at the ballpark and I get to wondering as to how the rest of their life goes when they're not empowered by the anonymity of crowds and cheap beer to vent the darkest parts of their souls. Surely, life does not reward them for that behavior. And as exuberant as they are at the moment that you're seeing them in the bleachers or upper deck, they must be equally miserable at other times. But no, that's not the case. As the story of Hack Wilson and the Milkman suggests, sometimes life just hands them 5-figure bonuses for that same behavior. Now, I don't know that this is true, but I like to imagine that the milkman, having picked up his rather large check in about the middle of 1929, used it as the basis for an even larger margin purchase of stock, say AT&T, RCA, GE, you name it, because telling off Hack Wilson for being a bad player was going to be his ticket out of the dairy business and right to Easy Street. But then one dark day that October, not long after the Cubs finished playing in the World Series, all of it was gone. A lot of good people lost their life savings around that time, and a great deal of suffering ensued, and we should always feel bad about that. But for that select few who had secured their nest egg by causing pain to others, well, we can only hope that as they stared into the abyss of complete ruin and destitution, they might have asked themselves, "Why didn't you bench yourself, you so-and-so?" I'm Stephen Goldman. This is The Infinite Inning. Oh, Randolph, we have but one pair of pants between us. That's no trouble, Beatrice. One leg for you and one leg for me. It doesn't work that way, Randy. We'll be positively indecent when the rescuers come. Ha! I scoff at their petty bourgeois notions of decency. I would refuse to be rescued by such people. But what about your deformity? Deformity? I'd always been told by my mother that it was normal. Oh, I'm so humiliated. You've had to look at it all this time. No, I've rather grown to appreciate it. Still, what if we shroud ourselves in episode 79? No, it may still offend them if we are beshrouded together under one episode. That would hardly be chivalrous of me. You don episode 79, and I will hold this seagull over my deformity. But Randolph, we may not be rescued for years. Then I will hold this seagull over my deformity for as long as it takes. Welcome back to the show. Somewhere during the show, Jackie Robinson came up, as he often does, and Jesse made a comment that he was not going to say that baseball had experienced 150 years of discrimination. It was only 71 years. And I said, since Jackie. And I didn't agree with that exactly when we said it, and the shape of the conversation was such that I couldn't or didn't manage to interject it right then. But no, I think 150 years is correct. I think that you can't say, and I very much doubt that Jesse meant it this way, that the exclusion of African Americans prior to Jackie Robinson didn't in itself constitute a distinct but equally brutal attack on African Americans. One of the best things about doing research for the stories that I tell on this show is the bits of baseball lore that I come across that I wasn't looking for, but turn out to be as good or better than the thing I was looking for. I found the Boston District Attorney story from last week while I was looking for something else, and I found what I'm about to tell you about while I was looking at that story. There is an anecdote I often like to tell about researching my Casey Stengel book, which I did primarily before most of the research resources we now have online existed. So it was hours and hours in libraries with microfilm. And in the course of scrolling and scrolling and scrolling past various non-baseball stories, I would often pass the comics page. And even though my time was at a premium, because if I was in an out-of-town library, I might have walked in at 9 o'clock and I was going to stay till 5, and that wasn't enough time. I would get sucked into reading the comics page, and I probably read a good 5 years of Little Abner continuity at one point. Anyway, it's not Little Abner that I want to tell you about today. It's a story that is almost far enough away to have been about Abner Doubleday, and yet is also still relevant to today. I kick around a lot of stories for this here podcast and discard a great many of them, and this was almost one of them. It didn't really crystallize for me as to why I needed to tell it until a member of the Infinite Inning Facebook group told me that he teaches history, and I, in my friendly way, asked him what his kids were learning about right now, and he said the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892. Please don't switch off the podcast, I promise. I know when I was that age, I probably wanted to switch off my teacher when it came to talking about issues in history that, in their way, are more important or as important as the big clashes of arms like the Civil War. But I promise you, there's a great deal of baseball in here too, and some action, unfortunately, but some action. When the strike came up, I finally understood why this story, which has to begin at the end for it to make sense, had been tugging at my shirt sleeve. And it was this question. Life is a struggle, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a struggle between people. That is a very controversial statement, and over time it has led to a lot of people getting dead over advocating for that position. The rise of social Darwinism in the 19th century took Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution and survival of the fittest, a phrase that he never himself wrote, and twisted them so that they applied to questions of class. And from there, it was a simple hop, skip, and extrapolation to apply the idea to race as well. There's been a lot of pushback on it, good pushback in terms of race over the years. But economically, we're not quite done with those ideas. And so when it comes to money and where each of us is economically in relation to the rest of our society, there are some who still believe that each of us is on our own, and if you don't make it, it's your own damn fault and your loss and your consequences to deal with, and those who believe that we should cooperate with each other. And that's a vast oversimplification, and there's a whole spectrum and a series of degrees in terms of mating those two ideas, so that some of us are not capitalism's golden children and others are capitalism's roadkill. But the questions remain. What do we owe each other when things don't work out, or even when they do, especially when they do? When some of us have leverage to negotiate and some don't. If you are in a position of advantage over someone who doesn't have that leverage, do you drive them to the wall and extract every penny that you can, or do you try to give them full or fair value for their services and live a little less high yourself? These issues came together in baseball and in the outside world, which is maybe an artificial distinction, in the early 1890s. As I said, the story begins at the end when Babe Ruth hit a home run while playing left field for the New York Giants. You might wonder how it is that the Babe homered for the Giants when he never played for the Giants. Well, this was a special occasion. On October 3rd, 1923, on an off day during the regular season and about a week before the World Series was due to start, not coincidentally, it was between the Yankees and the Giants, third year in a row for that, the Giants hosted the Baltimore Orioles, then just a minor league team in the International League, in a benefit game that was played in order to aid two very old, two very sick, and very impoverished gentlemen. One was John B. Day, 75 years old, and the other was Jim Mutry, who was 72. The Orioles pitched their ace, a guy named Lefty Grove, so unknown, at least to the New York Times at that point, that their article on the game kept referring to him as Groves, plural. The Giants whomped him, actually, 9-3, in part because Ruth pulled a home run to right field at the Polo Grounds that actually cleared the roof and went out of the building, which is not something you read about happening a whole lot. I feel obliged to mention here that Casey Stengel pinch hit a triple. Only 5,000 attended the game, no doubt out of a lack of appreciation for who Day and Momentary were. As it was, only Momentary got there. Day was too ill. The goal was to fund a pension for each of those gentlemen, who, as I said, were destitute. Why were they destitute? Why had they earned a fundraiser? Find out after this brief break. All they had done to earn that effort in their day was bring National League Baseball to New York by founding the Giants. They named the Giants. Well, Momentary did. According to legend, somebody pointed out that he liked large baseball players. His first baseman, the future Hall of Famer Roger Connors, was 6'3", which was gigantic for those days when Americans didn't get a great deal of protein in their diets. "Those lads of yours are giants," someone observed, and Momentary, not missing a beat, said, "They're giants on the field as well, my giants," and the name stuck. I'm getting ahead of the story again. In the early 1880s, John Day was in the tobacco business, and he had made some money. He liked baseball, played it a little bit, apparently not well, and wanted to back a pro team. He happened to meet up with Momentary, who is an ex-player from Massachusetts, and they formed a partnership with Day providing the funds and Momentary providing the baseball knowledge. Their first team was the New York Metropolitans, the original Mets. That team eventually ended up in the American Association, a league that aspired to major league status like the National League, but didn't quite get there. There was some thought at the time that the Mets might ultimately get promoted into the National League, but it never happened, and to this day, the Mets have still not achieved major league status. Anyway, they did want to be in the National League. Day and Momentary did, and the National League didn't have a team in what would become New York City. This is so long ago that we have to say it that way, what would become New York City, because the 5 boroughs didn't unite into one municipality until 1898, so we're actually ahead of that. At that time, the NL had clubs in places like Providence, Rhode Island, and Worcester, Massachusetts, and Troy, New York, but not in the city. But after the 1882 season, the Troy Trojans went belly up, and Day bought the assets, including the players, and moved the team to New York. They initially played both teams at the Polo Grounds, which at this point wasn't any kind of stadium, but was literally just Polo Grounds. Day and Momentary divided it in two with a canvas fence, put a diamond on each side, and you could go on one side or the other and see your favorite team play. Momentary would eventually be listed as the manager of both teams, which, if you didn't know any better, would suggest that he somehow cloned himself and could simultaneously sit on the home bench when the Mets played at home and on the road bench when the Giants went off to Detroit to play the Wolverine. The truth is, though, that he wasn't really the Giants' field manager. That was Buck Ewing, their best player and another future Hall of Famer, the team's catcher. Unlike Connor, by the way, who didn't get into the Hall until 1976, Ewing was one of the first players in. He was thought to be that good that the place just wouldn't have been legitimate without him. As for Momentary, one of the team's big pitchers, Smiling Mickey Welch, yet another future Hall of Famer hanging around there, said, "Yeah, Jim managed both teams, but managing in those days was different. Today they'd call Momentary the business manager. The feller who gave the orders on the field, the man who ran the team, was Buck Ewing. Momentary, though, he was a fine man, a grand man. He stirred up interest. He'd stand on the steps at the park with his high hat and fancy coat, and as the crowd came in or went out, he'd be shaking his cane and shouting, 'We are the people!' He'd stand up in the hacks in other cities and shout it as we drove to the ballparks with the rooters for the other team hooting at us." I have to tell you, I find this tremendously endearing. I wish there was a GM or owner who would do this today. Bill Veeck used to sit in the stands with the fans sometimes, and that's the most recent version or analog to this that I can think of. In addition to running the team, Momentary was a cheerleader. And there's something especially wonderful and American about this guy with his big hat and his bigger mustache, his spats and his cane in the grandstand, rallying the team with, "Who are the people?" and the fans coming back shouting, "We are the people." I mean, this is the city of Ellis Island at the peak of Ellis Island. This is the city of all the nationalities and ethnicities of Europe crammed on top of each other in Lower East Side tenements, all striving to achieve their version of the American dream, and there they are cheering their team with a rallying cry right out of the United States Constitution. And it's positive. It's not anything like "Yankees suck" or whatever the 1880s version of that would have been.
Bean eaters suck. But something affirmative. Who are the people? We are the people. I am choosing, by the way, to look at this as not implying that, say, Detroit Wolverines fans or the Detroit Wolverines themselves were not the people. But indulge me just one last time. Who are the people? We are the people. Contrast that with what we've got today, which, off the baseball field, includes lock her up, lock her up. I much prefer who are the people, we are the people. Yeah, it does sound kind of dangerous if you think about putting it in those people's mouths. Well, never mind. Anyway, one other great idea that we should probably credit Momentary for is the idea of a postseason championship series. He needed to think that up because in 1888 and 1889, with players like Connor Ewing Welch, Tim Keefe, and John Montgomery Ward, they won the National League pennant. This was the height of the early Giants franchise and almost its end. It was the end of the line for Momentary and Day, certainly. After that season, the players walked out and formed their own league. The National League owners had tried to impose salary limits on the player as a group. The players wanted to be able to bargain individually. So here is like a symphony, a peak of unintended consequences, because the players said, okay, you want to treat us like we're one group, like we're a union? Fine, we'll be a union. And then they took that union, quit on their ball clubs, and formed their own leagues. And just about the entire Giants roster left. To keep going, Day had to buy a whole bunch of players from another National League franchise that no longer exists, the Indianapolis Hoosiers, and from their owner, a fellow named John Brush, who got a chunk of Giants ownership in exchange. He also had to borrow money from other National League owners and some Wall Street people as well, with the upshot being that Day ended up being a minority shareholder in his own baseball team. This was really a dangerous time for baseball, at least in terms of the structures by which we still know it, because with the National League, the American Association, and the Players League all going at once, there was just too much baseball for the customers, and not all of them could survive. The Players League didn't, and the American Association also died. The NL tottered, and when Day's lenders extracted their pound of flesh, they insisted that he can Momentary. He managed to put it off for a year, but Momentary was gone after the 1891 season, and in 1892, they got rid of Day himself. In return for the gift of New York National League Baseball, not to mention a great franchise which lives on in San Francisco, Day and Momentary ended up with nothing. They didn't even get a copy of the home game. Maybe that's capitalism. You take your chances and quite often you lose, and hey, they got a charity game, didn't they? Well, sure, but a charity game is the relief pitcher who throws the top of the ninth when the home team is up or down by 10 or more runs. It doesn't work retroactively to cure the injury. By the time the Giants got around to the Day for Day and Momentary with Babe Ruth, both men were both literally paupers. At the same time that baseball was falling apart because of the Players League and Day and Momentary were being defenestrated right out of the game, a different kind of negotiation was happening in Homestead, Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh. Andrew Carnegie had a steelworks in a company town there that was run by a rather humorless man named Henry Clay Frick. Carnegie liked to preach about social Darwinism and how struggle was good for the race and good for the individual, and that America was a great place for struggle because there was so much opportunity. Just look at what he, an immigrant from Scotland, had accomplished. He also said things like, the right of the working man to combine and form trade unions is no less sacred than the right of the manufacturer to enter into association with his fellows. He said things like that, but he didn't really mean them. His plants ran in 12-hour shifts, 6 and 7 days a week, and they were deadly. It was very easy to have a steel beam or two dropped on you during your workday, and you don't come back from that. He continually pressed his managers to keep costs down, which of course means going faster and keeping safety down, so he could live like a king and, keep doing philanthropic things like donating his famous libraries to workers who were then taxed on their meager salaries to keep the libraries going. The libraries, by the way, were prevented from carrying anything the workers might want to read, like, say, books on unionizing. If you travel around the country, you can visit some of the great houses built by the railroad and steel robber barons, the tycoons of the late 1890s. Frick's is now an art museum consisting mostly of his personal collection. It's right in the middle of Manhattan, and if you like art, I encourage you to visit. It's a quick museum because how big can one man's collection be in the 1890s? But there's also a beautiful court in the middle. I think that was added later after Frick's demise, where there's a fountain and some chairs, and it's just a nice contemplative spot. Don't worry about Frick, though. Even if he didn't have that court while he was alive, he lived quite nicely in that place and in other places. And that's because labor had such a small voice at the time that they didn't get anything like a fair share of the revenues from these businesses. You visit these houses and you see things like wallpaper, which you think is inlaid with silver. And then you find out, no, silver is for poor people. These were inlaid with platinum. Frick had the original painted-from-life portraits by Hans Holbein the Younger of Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell facing off over his fireplace. And the tragedy of all that conspicuous consumption by him and the Vanderbilts and so on is that if he had possessed a soul and ran his business or the businesses that he ran for Carnegie with just enough fairness that the workers were not showing up 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and still living in poverty, very little, if anything, would have changed for him or for them because they had that much dough. As I said earlier, you take your chances, you place your bets, and if it pays off for you, you deserve to live well. But if your employees are dying for you to live well, if they're living in poverty while you build castles, that's an exploitation. In the aftermath of the Homestead Strike, Senator John Palmer of Illinois, who was one of the original founding Republicans, said that owners of corporations must be regarded as holding their property subject to the rights of those without whose services the property would be utterly valueless. At most times after that, they would have called that communism. Maybe they did call it communism. But once again, I'm getting ahead of the story. Carnegie had broken most of the unions at his steel plants, but there was still one at Homestead, the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers. In 1892, their contract was up, and Frick and Carnegie decided to break that union. They bargained in bad faith, declared an impasse, and when they did, Frick threw up a brick wall 11 feet high and topped it with 3 miles of barbed wire and locked out all the workers. That is a very aggressive gesture because there was no unemployment at that time. There was no social safety net. There was no union defense fund that was going to feed these people. All the workers, their families, and their children were, in short order, going to go hungry so long as the disagreement persisted. Frick's plan, and I should point out that Carnegie had very conveniently buggered off to Scotland during all of this and was being kept informed by wire. And although that gave him some deniability about what Frick did, he was informed of most steps all along the way and was cheerleading for Frick to do what he had to do to get the deal that they wanted to get. So Frick's plan was to bring in scabs. Thing is that the plant was right on the Monongahela River, and the only land approach was through the company town, which was controlled by the union. So when Frick had the local sheriff's department show up to quote-unquote guard the plant, which really meant open it up so the scabs could get through, the union folks would not allow him to do that. They said, we'll be happy to guard the plant for you. Which, okay, all of this has happened before, and at this point in the history of labor and ownership, there is a playbook for this, and it involves hiring the famed Pinkerton Detective Agency to come in and break the strike. Again, they can't go by land, so they decide to come by sea, or by river, I guess is the more accurate way to put it. And so Frick gets 2 big barges, loads them up with guns, and puts 300 Pinkertons on them, and has them towed up to the intended beachhead in front of the plant. The thing is that the union sees this coming. They too have guns, and they will not let the Pinkertons off of the boat. And so on July 6, 1892, there is a firefight on and off that lasts for about 14 or 15 hours most of a day. And in the end, 9 workers and 3 Pinkerton men are dead, and about 25 are wounded, counting both sides. The tugboat that hauled the Pinkertons up there had taken off with the wounded, and so they were just stuck there on the barges, and yeah, they were armed, but the Union guys were keeping themselves busy thinking of creative ways to sink those barges. They never succeeded, but they had fun firing cannon shot at them and trying to set the river on fire. So the Pinkertons guaranteed safe conduct out of there surrendered. The Union didn't quite honor that, and they kind of beat the crap out of the Pinkerton men as they went out via the town. Now, that would seem like a victory, and it sort of was, but Frick can now say, "We have an insurrection on our hands, civil disorder, call out the state militia," which the governor did. The Union felt they had no choice but to respect the state militia, and so the Scabs were able to get in, and the plant was restarted. Still, they had a lot of public support, or they did, until an anarchist named Alexander Berkman, a Russian immigrant who lived in Massachusetts with a woman I don't think anyone had heard of yet who would shortly become famous, Emma Goldman, no relation in case you were wondering, who had nothing to do with any of this, but decided that it was his mission to convert labor to true radicalism by assassinating Henry Clay Frick. He was able to walk into Frick's office, shoot him at close range, and got off a second shot, and then, during a struggle, stabbed him a bunch of times, but still didn't manage to kill him. And you have to understand that Frick was a very bad guy. We're not even scratching the surface of how bad he was here. But then and now, no one condones murder. Public support for the Union evaporated, and combine that with some court decisions against them. I'm shortening this up quite a bit. The Union was destroyed. Frick and Carnegie, they won, although Carnegie's reputation took a hit that troubled him the rest of his life and lasts to this day. And as for Frick, I don't think he really cared, and his reputation was low enough that it couldn't be damaged anyway. In his 1888 utopian science fiction novel, Looking Backward, Edward Bellamy wrote, "At last, strangely late in the world's history, the obvious fact was perceived that no business is so essentially the public business as the industry and commerce on which the people's livelihood depends, and that to entrust it to private persons, to be managed for private profit, is a folly similar in kind, though vastly greater in magnitude, to that of surrendering the functions of political government to kings and nobles to be conducted for their personal glorification. Some would denounce that as socialistic or communistic. Whatever you call it, it's basically right. That doesn't mean that communism is a good system or one that this program's advocating, because it's not. It doesn't work in practice. It also doesn't mean pure capitalism is a good system, because it doesn't work real well either. Both leave too many casualties behind and are too easily exploited by greed. The only thing I know is that ending up with nothing is too easy in any economic system, and that everyone needs something, but no one needs everything. This is the way we've set it up, but it doesn't have to be that way. It could be about cooperation, not a horse race with one winner. Strangely, it's those who have everything who are much more likely to have access to Babe Ruth. Sure, sometimes, as the Giants did for Momentary and Day, somebody grabbed him and put him to good use, but that's just one game for the benefit of just two people. There were a whole lot more put more or less permanently out of work in Homestead in 1892, as Day and Momentary were put out of work in 1892. Those workers at Homestead who were replaced by Scabs that same year, as far as I know, no one has hit a home run for them, not to this day. By Aunt Sally's double secret recipe for chocolate rum balls, we have come to the end of another show.
Nov Schmaz Kapop, this is where I used to tell you how to find us on Twitter, but we are no longer on Twitter, and neither are you. But for current purposes, you can find me at stephengoldman.bsky.social, and I very much hope you'll join me there. It's a much more pleasant and benign location than the old hangout.
I went. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group. Go to Facebook, search Infinite Inning, knock, I will let you in. And if anything is going on with this show or you have a comment, you'll be the first to make it or the first to know about it. Switch that, reverse it. And finally, if you have a spare moment, go to the podcatcher of your choice, Apple, iTunes, or what have you, and rate, review, and subscribe. It helps a great deal. And if your podcatcher doesn't allow you to do those things, well, you show them who's boss by doing it anyway. And if you can't exercise your franchise there, then one last reminder to vote, not for me, but in the midterm elections this coming week. We have a sponsor now, but nevertheless, this episode is brought to you by the number 44. Our producer is Martin Chuzzlewit. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring. It's called The Infinite Man. Dr. Rick reminds you that the thing we most dread might be locked inside an unopened box, but so might a nifty toy surprise. And one way or another, you gotta eat all your Cracker Jack to find out. Well, if the gingerbread man doesn't run away from the baker and join the RAF shouting, "You can't catch me, I've got a Lancaster bomber," I'll be back next week.
Actually, the week after that, given the July 4th holiday, but I look forward to seeing you then for episode 338.